Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Dawne Clark. She is with us from Mount Royal University. She's a retired professor. Really great knowledge in terms of physical literacy in the early years. So I'm going to pass it off to Dawne to share with you some information.
Okay, my name is Dawne Clark. As Emma said, I am a retired professor from Mount Royal University. Although I am still a director, I'm still there on contract. I teach in the department, or I taught in the Department of Child Studies and Social Work in the Child Studies degree. I've deliberately started with a picture, a photo of children outside, because as Drew has raised, this whole notion of being able to be outside is an issue. There's a great book, The Last Child in the Woods, if you haven't seen that one, talking about how we just aren't getting our children outside. And it is a worrisome thing to think about. If children don't appreciate the great outdoors as children, will they come to want to protect it and champion it down the roads? Those of you as old as me know about Joni Mitchell and her song, paving over the green space, paving the parking lot, right? So the work that I'm going to talk about today is something that we're doing through the Center for Child Wellbeing at Mount Royal, and that's my contract piece is as director of that. So I'm going to talk again within the ECE space primarily, but I think that affects most of you. And I want to make really clear the difference between physical activity and physical literacy, and see it as a developmental journey for you. So physical activity is movement that requires energy, increases your heart rate, and your speed of breathing. Now, normally in the other spaces we've been, Drew's had a little bit more room, and by now he would have already had you up and jogging around the room, doing various things with that. So when I get to this slide, everybody's going, yeah, I know what physical activity is, right? So we'll start with that. So why is it important? One of the other things we've noticed over the week is that everybody is giving different stats. So these are Alberta stats, which may or may not compare to what you're doing in Ontario. So the first one actually is a Canadian stat. So 35% of our children between the ages of 2 and 5 are overweight or obese. That's a really frightening stat. And if you think back to children between the ages of 2 to 5, 20 years ago, either if you're old enough to have had children or yourself when you were between 2 and 5, chances are you were this scrawny little kid. You didn't have time to eat properly because you were too busy running around. So to think that our children now in that age group are overweight or obese is quite worrisome. The other thing we know from the Healthy Kids report card is that children between the ages of 2 to 5 spend 75% of their waking day sedentary. So they're on their screens, or they're sitting in circle time, or they're restrained in high chairs, strollers, cribs, especially car seats, right? But the screen time piece is the worrisome piece. The Canadian Pediatric Society recommends that children up and below the age of 2 have 0 screen time, 0. And then from 2 to 4, 1 hour a day. And all of you can think of examples, and perhaps you yourself have done it, that, you know, you're walking down the street, the child's in the stroller fussing because she's restrained in the stroller, so you hand her an iPad or a phone. And they get so adept at that. When we've talked to parents about this, they've said, well, you know, it's great that Treehouse is on the TV 24/7. What do I do when I wake up, when the child wakes up in the middle of the night? I can put him down in front of Treehouse for half an hour, and then I can get back to sleep. We need to think a little bit about that. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Alberta Teachers Association, the Calgary Teachers Convention, and they presented a project called Growing Up Digital, which was a joint project between the Alberta Teachers Association and Boston Children's Hospital, Yale. And they asked about 2,000 teachers and principals across the province what changes they have noticed in the children in their classroom over the last 5 years, teachers from K to 12. And the teachers were talking about things like the children are more irritable, they're more anxious, they're more sleep deprived, they're concerned about their peer relationships and being able to respond immediately on their phones. And the teachers in the early years, K1, 2, and 3, were talking about how their children were less prepared for school in terms of small motor coordination, except for their thumbs, and their ability to focus on anything other than a screen. And in high school, the focus was a big piece because they're so used to reading on a screen and hitting a hyperlink every few sentences so they could change topics and move from here to there. And so the ability to read something in depth they felt was really jeopardized. So this whole idea of screen time, now the interesting thing with the Growing Up Digital project is now we're going to look at preschool children and see if we can understand if there's any relationship between screen time for young children and brain development for young children, because we have no idea. Going back to those Canadian Pediatric Society recommendations of 0 screen time in 1 hour, they're actually in conversations now about revising those guidelines because they've been too stressful for parents. So how did we get involved in physical activity, physical literacy story? So back to my child studies students, in 3rd year, we bring the group together and they do an applied community-based research course. And so one group of students, way back in 2007, wanted to find out how much physical activity. So in 2007, we're still talking physical activity, not physical literacy. They wanted to find out how much physical activity children in a 10-hour childcare day were receiving. So they went out, they surveyed 150 childcare centers in the city of Calgary, and it was ECE report of the amount of physical activity they provided for their children. The scary results of that, 75% were receiving 30 minutes of physical activity in a 10-hour day. Now for children ages 1 to 4, now that we have guidelines, and this was actually a hoot, because in 2007, we did not have physical activity guidelines for children under the age of 5. You may remember that Participation used to talk about, we have physical activity guides for the entire lifespan, from 5 to 95. So in 2007, we didn't have anything to work with. We didn't know what was recommended. But at that time, school age was still 120 minutes, 90 minutes to 120. It's actually been reduced to 60 minutes. Do you know why? Nobody was meeting the other guidelines. So they reduced them. So we used 120 minutes at that time. We didn't know about the 180 that are now currently recommended. So think about a childcare day, and those of you who have had children in childcare or those of you who work in childcare, so the mornings are a disaster. You're just trying to get up, get dressed, get food down them, get the school bags packed and in the car. You pick the children up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, you're exhausted, you've had a busy day. All you want to do is get home, make supper, get the children in the bath, read a bedtime story, and get the little ones to bed by 7:30 or 8. So if you have, whether it was 120 at the time that we were working here, or 180 minutes as we know now, and children are only getting 30 minutes during their 10-hour day, when are they getting their physical activity? They're not. So that starts to make sense about the overweight and obesity stats, right? So we think children are running around in childcare and getting all this activity, but we also know that children are not allowed to run around indoors at childcare. We deliberately set up our spaces so that there aren't straight lines for children to run, and we encourage them to stay relatively quiet during their childcare day. And that's for safety reasons, right? So the students were horrified because we'd been learning about physical activity and early brain development and the importance of it to holistic development for children. And so the students and I started this process of how are we going to respond. And we believed we could respond with 3 pillars. So one was to provide resources for ECEs, then to provide the education for ECEs, and then maybe we could support them with some new policy, is where we thought we'd go. We had some considerations. So if we're going to do this work, we need to think about ECE philosophy. So first of all, healthy overall development and early brain development. Now, I haven't put any early brain development slides in here, so you're going to get a little bit of an aside. I use a metaphor with early brain development. And early brain, if you think of this, it helps sort of set the context, so I'm not going to give you a neuroscience course. But building a brain is like building a house. What's the most important thing when you're building a house? The foundation, and that's us, right? We're setting the foundation. If we were to build our house on a marsh, in a floodplain, on a rocky field where we didn't clear the rocks, on the side of a steep hill, chances are our house isn't going to last very long, certainly not for our lifetime. And our brain is the only brain we're going to get for a lifetime. It has to last. So we need a really solid foundation. Then the next part of a house is that you have 4 walls. And I'll simplify the domains of development to cognitive, social, emotional, and physical. And if you use spiritual, I use spiritual as the hearth or the fireplace that we build in the house that keeps us warm. Okay? Now, many of you, I'm quite sure, have parents who come in and at 3 years old want their children sitting down, doing seat work, learning to read and write so they'll be ready for school. The reality is, first of all, that's focusing only on the cognitive wall. A strange-looking house, if you've got 1 tall, sturdy wall and 3 weakling little walls, it's not going to stand. We also know that reading and writing is not predictive of school success. What is predictive of school success are the softer skills that happen in the other areas. The ability to regulate emotions, to learn that it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to hit, bite, or kick your friends. It depends on being able to get along with others, to mediate disputes, to take turns. Those things are crucial. Cognitively, it's not reading and writing. It's being able to focus, to be able to ignore distractions. How can you learn in a classroom if the other 25 kids in the classroom are distracting you? You have to learn how to ignore distractions. You have to be able to plan ahead. Here's my goal. It may just be the goal for this activity, or a goal for the day, or a goal for the week. But we have to be able to set goals. And we have to be able to change those goals if they're not working. That's the important cognitive piece. And of course, the physical piece is if we do not have a healthy body in which this brain is living, this brain is not going to be able to function. So that's what's important for being ready for school. If you're interested in early brain, I'd encourage you to go to Harvard's Center on the Developing Child. They've been doing some amazing work, and all of their working papers, their briefs, their videos are all written in lay language. They're for us. So you don't need to be a neuroscientist. They also really validate the importance of the work that the people in the early years do. So I'd encourage you to visit that site. In Alberta, we're very fortunate to have a family foundation that's focusing on this. It's called the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. Fabulous videos again, all kinds of information. And of course, early childhood philosophy is learning through play. So those were our considerations. Our first step was hop, skip, and jump. So I was really proud of this resource when the students created it, because the students did. Our second-year students in a play course created a number of activities for children that they had to address the barriers of limited space, limited time, limited equipment, and limited ability for ECEs to prepare. They had to address all of those. So they created these activities. We gave the activities to our first-year early learning students, who took them out to practicum and tried them out. And so their mentors in the centers gave feedback, helped revise them, put adaptations in there. How do you deal with children of different ages and abilities? How do you transition into the activity? How do you transition out of the activity? And then what other things could you do with that to bring in the other developmental domains? So that's what's in our Hop, Skip, and Jump. So you can actually find it on our website, and you can download it for free. So we had Hop, Skip, and Jump out in the world, and the ACs said, wow, these are fun, but why am I doing them? So there was our education piece. What were the benefits? ECEs also, we found in that first 2007 survey, were not physically active themselves. They were new Canadians, right? In a large part, about 70% of our ECEs are new Canadians. So they're not physically active themselves. So we had, and of course, weather and space were huge barriers. And I get it. I have worked in toddler rooms, and I know what it's like to get toddlers into their snow pants and their snow boots and their mitts and their toques, and then the first one needs to go to the bathroom. So I get that. So here's where we focused in on the early brain development. This is the why. This truly is the why. So we know that physical activity helps the brain grow and develop. We know that the patterns, the life patterns that are set in the first 5 years, are the patterns that will continue throughout life. So if children learn to be physically active in the first 5 years, they're going to continue, chances are, to be physically active over the rest of their lifespan. If they learn to love their screens, they're going to continue to love their screens. And we know that early brain development sets the trajectory for health, and that's the most important one in this context. I'll refer you to another study called the ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's carried out in the United States by some physicians, been going on now for about 15 years. And what they have discovered, they were working with a middle class, people when they started this study, people who could afford health insurance in the United States. So middle class, primarily Caucasian population, who were coming to the hospital with health concerns. And when they started to do a retrospective discussion of what happened to them in their early years, if they had experienced abuse, neglect, parents who were unavailable because they had mental health issues or abused substances, if there was domestic violence in the home, there's a series of 10 questions. There was a direct correlation between those adverse childhood experiences and health in the 50s. So in other words, the brain in those early years actually is derailed by adverse experiences. Toxic stress is literally built into the structure of the brain. So if we go back to our building a brain is like building a house, we're putting in poor structural elements, or the wiring is faulty, or something's wrong in our house. Now, it's possible to go back and rewire and to renovate and to fix problems, but it's so much harder, and it's so much more costly. So we know that health, both physical and mental, comes right back to the experiences in the first 5 years. We know that those first 5 years, as I talked about, if we build a strong house, children will be more successful in school, they'll be more successful in work, and they'll have healthier relationships throughout life. So these I've basically talked about, but for infants, physical activity should be several times a day, lots of tummy time, getting children out of those restraints. If you're taking them outside, I get the idea of needing to put them in a stroller. And I watch the childcare centers in my area with the strollers that have 6 children in a row and they're pushing them down the sidewalk. They're at least getting fresh air. That's good. But let's put them out on the grass. Let's give them some tummy time on the grass. Limit the sedentary behavior. 180 minutes a day for children up to the age of 4, and limit screen time. So we'd worked on our resources, we'd worked on our education. We decided we wanted to focus on the policy piece. So in Alberta, we run a little bit differently than you do here. All of our childcare programs, so childcare, family day home, out-of-school care, and preschool programs are all provincial. They're the responsibility of the province. So everything is legislated and licensed, etc., provincially. We have a process called, and oh my goodness, we fought for this. We had strikes where in February, when it was -20, we were rolling all the children from the childcare to the provincial government buildings in each city and saying, you've got to value what we're doing here. 10 years ago, Alberta ECEs were the lowest paid in the province, in the country, bar none. And you could be a parking lot attendant and earn more than you could as an ECE, working with our most precious resource every single day. So from that, and part of the problem that we had is that Alberta is also different from Ontario in that you have about 75 or 80% of your centres are not-for-profit, and you only have a small piece at the top that are for-profit centres. Alberta, being a good, independent, entrepreneurial province, has reversed that. So about 75 to 80% of our centres are for-profit. And in fact, most of them are the big box centres that come out of the States with nanny cams and all the rest of this stuff. So the government's saying, we can't help you. You're a for-profit industry. You need to deal with this some other way. So we did manage to get a process of accreditation. And accreditation, and I know some areas in Ontario are doing this, is where you apply to be seen as better than the basic licensing standards. So we put in an accreditation process with 6 guidelines across all 4 of those fields: childcare, out-of-school care, preschool, family day home. And we lobbied that there be some physical literacy and sedentary behavior guidelines put in those accreditation standards. We were successful. We had 32 provincial consultations. Not one consultation said, no, this isn't important. So they put it into accreditation standards. And what does accreditation mean? First of all, you do between 6 to 12 months of self-study to provide evidence that you're meeting your accreditation standards. Then you get up to $6 an hour wage enhancement. You get PD, so the ability to come to a workshop or to take another course at college or university. The center gets an incentive in extra funding to buy equipment and materials, and the province will post your name on the website saying you're an accredited center. Huge incentives. 95% of our childcare centers in Alberta are accredited. Huge success, and I'm touting that because it's about the only time I can tout Alberta in this field. So in that, because of the difficulty, the fact that childcare may be 10 hours a day, out-of-school care maybe 2.5 or 3, preschool maybe 2.5 hours. Because of the different times, we said physical activity, physical literacy, 15 minutes an hour. That would be sort of how much you would figure you'd do. We celebrated for a week, and then the province said, okay, we want you to evaluate this. We've given it to you, now tell us how well it's working. So what this meant is that we had to help ECEs understand what this meant. What is physical literacy? How do you provide it? And so we started to look at it as active play, both structured and unstructured, and that it was a developmental process. So physical activity is running around, raising your heart rate, but physical literacy is actually a developmental process. So we developed some tools. The Apple model, which fits in perfectly with your theme of run, jump, play every day, only we call Apple stands for active play and physical literacy every day, besides an apple's healthy. We created a preschool fundamental movement skills chart and a physical literacy observation tool. Why? Well, ECEs are not phys ed teachers. Actually, as Dean's pointed out, most teachers aren't phys ed teachers. So we needed to figure out how we were going to support them. And we did it by relating it to active play, because active play is something that all of us in ECE try to do. We wanted to have them see it as holistic development. We wanted to reassure them that they weren't going to have to go back to the playroom and teach children how to throw a ball properly. And yes, I throw like a girl. We wanted to build on the early childhood philosophy of learning through play. So, what is active play? In Alberta, we teach an active play cycle, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a moment here. So our cycle of active play is that, first of all, you need to create a stimulating environment. And I saw a perfect example of that when you picked up your bags. What did you do? You brought them back to your table, you zipped them open, you pulled out the wobble boards, you pulled out the noodles and started to bang them together. You were looking at all the things that were inside your bag. So Emma created for you an environment that incited your curiosity. And so we do that for children. Once they're curious, then you zip open the bag and you start to explore what's inside. Now, you were all very well-mannered and you put your stuff back in the bag and most of you took them out to the car. However, with children, they would want to explore that bag, take something out, and repeat to mastery. So those of you with young children know that your child wanted the same bedtime story night after night after night after night until you were trying to cheat on what you were reading and they caught you at it, or they insisted that you start again, and then all of a sudden they'd mastered it, and that was it. They put that book away. The other thing children have, they are so persistent. Unless a child has a developmental disability, do you know of any infant who did not learn to walk? Children fall, they get up. They fall, they get up. They fall, they get up until they walk. Adults, not so much. I'm a skier, and my son determined I was going to snowboard. So first of all, putting both feet strapped together, and I couldn't move them, was really a problem for me. So he took me up the little bunny hill, and like an infant, I fell, and I got up. I fell, and I got up, and I got to the bottom of the hill, and I took off the snowboard and said, "This is yours." That's enough, right? So we don't have the same level of persistence that infants and preschoolers do. So they repeat to mastery, they build this sense of confidence, and then they're ready to start and explore something that's more challenging or something that's a little different. And so in our environments, we need to make sure that every time the children come in, there's something that's going to incite their curiosity. There's something on the science desk. I think it might be a wasp's nest. Are there any wasps in that nest? Can I touch it? And then on you go. So it requires that we change up our environment as children master what we've put out, continue to build the challenges, continue to intrigue children in their learning. Now, physical literacy, Drew gave you the expanded version. And for ECE, we just use the first three. We want young children to be motivated, confident, and competent to move for a lifetime. It's very difficult for them to manage their own physical trajectory, so we'll leave that for when they get older. But these are the most important things. Does this sound at all like the cycle of active play? So we put them together. So around the skin of this lovely red apple is the cycle of active play. The core of this red apple is the physical literacy. So what we're saying to ECEs, you don't need to know how to throw a ball. You just need to provide active play. And when you do that, you're providing the basic elements for physical literacy. So as Drew said, we're not asking you to do anything new. We're just asking you to think about it differently. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, we have an amazing child development lab at Mount Royal. And so we get to play with children all the time. And these particular children are ones from our child care center. And I was so pleased to see that both bags for ECEs and the school age will have wobble boards. And in fact, it's the same wobble board. It has the same ladybug on the top, which is really cool. So one day, my students just put out a wobble board. They didn't say anything. They didn't introduce it to the children. They just put it out. So she goes to step on it, and oops, it tipped. So her hands are down there trying to support her, and she's trying to figure out what's going on. And this little guy here is going, what? You know, he's all ready to catch her when she falls off, right? So look at this. Isn't that awesome? They're trying to figure out why the wobble board is wobbling. Now, we haven't labeled it yet, but she's looking underneath. He's right down there. What's going on with this thing? And then she gets back on and she says, okay, well, I've figured out if I stand on the edge of it, it'll touch the ground. And so she spent the next 10 minutes while this little guy was hopping up and down, waiting his turn. She spent the next 10 minutes walking around the outside of the wobble board, tipping it down to the floor. They had an awesome time with that board, and you'll see some more photos as we go through. But the point is, nobody went up and said, oh, that's a wobble board, you stand in the middle and you balance. Right? So, curiosity, exploration, and then we're going to see a lot of repetition to mastery in their own way. So let's think about physical literacy as a development tool. So all of us in ECE, in the early learning space, are concerned about developing language among children. So we want language to become a part of us so that we can participate actively in society. So we create a language-rich environment. We read stories, we sing songs, we do finger stories, we have puppets. We put environmental literacy around the room, so we label the fridge and the housekeeping center and the block center and so on. Very concerned with creating a language-rich environment. We provide opportunities for the children to engage and interact with it. So in the housekeeping center, we put out paper and they can write shopping lists. Over in that science center where we've put the wasp's nest, we have a book about wasps and wasps' nests. Maybe we put some colored paper so they can be drawing some things that they're reading about. So we ensure that they have lots of opportunities to engage. Gradually more complex experiences. So we might, in the infant room and the toddler room, just use pictures to label things. And then as they get more adept, we start to add the words. It's all play-based and child-led activities, and the adults step in when we need to provide some feedback, maybe to correct the grammar or something like that. But we don't sit down and say, today we're going to learn the word cat. Cat, cat, right? We don't do that with 3-year-olds. So physical literacy is no different. I only had to make 2 slight changes. So physical literacy becomes a part of us so we can actively participate in society. We want to have a movement-rich environment. So maybe over at that science table, where there is the wasp's nest and the book and the colored paper, we put an exercise ball. So while children are reading the book or coloring, they're balancing on the exercise ball. Or maybe in the housekeeping center, We encourage them to stand on the wobble board while they're cooking supper. Or we encourage them to follow Polly spots on the floor, walking, or hopping like a bunny, or slithering like a snake from one center to another. So how do we infuse activity in our environment? Again, play-based, child-led, and we intervene or we participate only to extend the play, to ask questions, to encourage. Right? Does that make sense? So then we can say, what are the other benefits? We already know about early brain development, positive interrelationships, holistic development, fundamental movement skills that develop with our feedback and support, and ensuring, and this is the most important piece, this is where we're really coming to understand this is going to be the core of our work. We need to support ECEs themselves to feel motivated, confident, and competent to provide physical literacy for their children. So you'll see this if you go on the Sport for Life website, just the idea that if you can run, you'll be able to do all of these other things when you're grown up. If you learn how to throw when you're younger, you'll be able to do those other things. So just as we build more complex skills on top of the simpler skills, our role is to support the development of the simpler skills so the more complex can come. What are fundamental movement skills? Well, they're the ABCs, as Drew pointed out. More complex skills. We wanted to determine what those were for preschool children because there's nothing in the literature about what kinds of movements preschool children should have. So in your package, you have a copy of this, which is our preschool fundamental movement skills chart. Just as Drew showed you with his diagram, we have the stability or the body skills at the top, the locomotion skills in the middle, and the object manipulation skills at the bottom. We haven't labeled them 1-year-old or 2-year-old. We just talked about what might you develop during the first year and the second year. And as with any other developmental piece, there are huge ranges in how children develop. But basically what we're trying to say is that if it's blue, then the child's body and brain are not yet ready to learn a skill. So you cannot take a 6-month-old infant and teach her how to climb the stairs. You can try all you want. It's not going to happen. So you notice that some of them, particularly down here in the manipulative skills, are the latest to develop skills. Stability starts first because you can't actually learn to walk until you can stand up and balance. The green and the yellow, that's the normal onset of development for children and the best time to support them. And then when you get to the red, then that's when those children might need some intervention. So we use this chart to develop our physical literacy observation tool. This is not a checklist that gives you a score at the end that you then report to parents. Your child is 70% physically literate. That's not the idea. The idea is to support ECEs in understanding the developmental process of fundamental movement skills and to give them an idea of what might be a simpler skill and a more complex skill in that area. So we're just kind of laying it out for ECEs. We're hoping then that they'll be able to use this to observe the children in their class and say, you know what? My kids are really good at locomotion, but I've never introduced balls. So they don't know how to throw or how to kick. I need to figure out how to put those into the environment. Also in your kit is this one page. I'm not able to give you the plot yet, the full plot, because it's undergoing psychometric testing. Before we can publish it and release it to the world, it has to be tested to make sure that it really is valid and reliable. Sorry, the academic world that constrains us. So this is one page, and this is the stability skills the way it currently looks. Those of you who are familiar with the NIPISing, Child Development Screening Tool, know that there's one age on one page. And what we decided to do, because of the huge range of development, is to make it sort of a sliding scale. So let's take a look at all the stability skills that we might consider in preschool. Start with the infants, the toddlers, and the preschoolers. So let's say you're observing a room full of toddlers. Rather than just starting in the green, you might want to go back and see, so do they have the simple skills? Because remember, you can't build the more complex skills unless they have the simple skills. So you might go back into the infant range and say, so do they have these skills? And then move into the toddler years. And then you're going to have some precocious children, and you can just keep going down into the preschool skills. But it gives you an overall idea of where your children are. Also in the tool, we're looking at what does the indoor environment look like? What does the outdoor environment look like? And what can you add to both of those to make your experience more stimulating for the children? We encourage that the plot be completed over the period of about a week. For those of you familiar with play or CAPL, you know you're required to set up an obstacle course, and you have the children run through the obstacle course one at a time. Don't try doing that with toddlers. So you want to be observing as they're playing over the period of a week. Any longer than a week, and we're concerned that you might have natural development clicking into there. So about a week, and you're watching for observable moments. One of the best observable moments in this country, and I've already mentioned it, is putting on snow pants and snow boots. Fabulous balance exercise, right? So the toddlers are sitting on the floor, one leg at a time. Then as they get to preschool and they're more eager to get outside, they're leaning against their wall, they're leaning against each other, they're pushing their foot into the leg and hoping they don't hit the crotch of the snow pants because they're going to fall over if they do, right? Perfect example of watching naturally. So here's our wobble board. So notice her hands, she's now running around the wobble board. That's her level of mastery. This little one over here watched for a while, walked over, stepped in the middle of the wobble board, and balanced. Is she more physically literate than the other? Maybe. Notice she's carrying a dice. Most children will spend most of their time carrying something. Locomotor skills. On our sensory rug, little infant, again carrying something, both in his hand and his mouth. We put out these poly spots. Oh, notice, the little guy finally gets on the wobble board. He finally gets there. And we put out these poly spots thinking we'd encourage some running, jumping, leaping, hopping, something. But she's decided she's just going to run through them, and can she make a number of different patterns without stepping on them. Notice her arms, how she's balancing as she's making her turns in her corners. And she's not getting in anybody's way because the poly spots are confined to one part of the room. We've cleared all the other toys away, so we've cleared away the hazards. I love this picture. Isn't that pure joy? Pure joy. So what this little fellow is doing, dropping the balls into the net on the other side, then he scoots around by holding himself on the board, because he's not yet fully balanced to walk, picks all the balls out, and throws them back over the other side. Look at the social development happening here. So now we've attracted a whole bunch to the wobble board. They're taking turns. They're supporting one another. And there's the little guy in there. He's trying to help everybody keep organized. Notice that she's now getting ready to throw a ball. So they figured this balancing on the wobble board's too easy. Let's make it more challenging, so we set out a net. And the goal was to stand on the wobble board and throw. Try it. So his job, the little fellow's job, was to pick up all the balls that didn't make it into the net and hand them back to those who wanted to throw again. Naturalistic observations. I'm finally a grandma. My kids are all in their 30s. I thought it would never happen. This is my granddaughter. So she's in London, England. I get to go next week to go see her. I haven't seen her since last August. This is her duck watching pose. So she gets down to the level of the ducks. She's already understood that piece. She can squat in that position for 15 or 20 minutes. Her hands aren't touching the ground. She's perfectly balanced in that deep squat. And what gets me, after 15 or 20 minutes, she just stands straight up and walks away. I would fall over. But then so this is at 18 months, and here we are at 36 months. Notice the different pose to get down to the ground. So she's now figured out with the knee down, she can move more quickly one way or the other, change her position more easily, and she can play in that pose. So again, naturalistic observations. So I talked about the psychometric testing of the plot. That's happening out here, by the way. So if you get a phone call from the Inch Lab at McMaster, would you like to be involved in helping us test the plot? Please say yes. As part of that testing, we were asked to create an intervention package, which of course is never a term we use. So what we did was create 12 sort of fully developed activities, which we then called Apple Seeds, because we're sowing the seeds of active play and physical literacy every day. It has 3 components to it, and this is the general exercise that we're going to work through this afternoon. So first of all, an introductory activity to set the context. So if we put this wasp's nest on the table, we could start with, what do you know about wasps? Why do they make nests? What are the nests made out of? Why do they, I'm going to show my ignorance. Do wasps bite or sting? I think hornets bite, wasps sting. Why do they bite? Why do they sting? So you're making sure that all the children have a common knowledge about wasps before you move on. You could be using art, story, drama, whatever you want to set the context. We're going to use a nature walk this afternoon. That's going to be how we set our context. And then there's a bit of an adult-led activity. So just getting the children to actually try some movement. Can you buzz around like a wasp? Bzzz, buzzing around like a wasp. So encouraging the children to be active in certain ways. But then the most important part of the activity is child-led play. How long does child-led play take? Five minutes? Yes. It takes 20 minutes to actually engage in play. And so when we provide 15 or 20-minute spaces for free play, we have not let the children actually engage in play. And you know exactly what that feels like. If I were to assign you group work right now, you would take 5 minutes anyway, just, okay, well, my name is, and where do you work, and what were we supposed to do then? I've forgotten the instructions. Oh, okay, well, let's get to work. It'll take you at least 5 minutes to get into the activity. Children a little bit longer because they've got a lot more to organize. So free play needs to be as long as they want to play. And that becomes a problem when you've got a schedule, but it's something for us to think about. So where are we going next? We're piloting the plot. What's our next project? It was one we hadn't actually expected. So the government asked us to evaluate the effectiveness of the accreditation policy. So we started to go around to visit centers who had been accredited under the new policy that included physical literacy. And they began to tell us, we're mandated to provide active energetic play for children. And then the licensing officer comes in and says, you can't do that. You can't have that in your indoor space. You can't have that in your outdoor space. And we all of a sudden realized that one arm was mandating active energetic play, and the other arm of government was saying, don't you dare, it's risky, it's going to create liability issues. So we're quite pleased that the Alberta government has actually funded us to take a look at this gap between accreditation and what might be seen to be risky play. So is it perceived? Is it real? And what can we do about it? So I noticed this morning Emma's having some of those Vine and Stock natural playground workshops. Katie Jewett, who is one of our senior students working on this project, is also doing a capstone in her 4th year. She's working with the Calgary Board of Education, and they're developing First Nations early learning family school for families who have children from 3 to 8, and the families are involved in that as well. So Katie found this website. She worked with them to design this incredible natural play space for our First Nations kids. Took the design to her supervisor at the Calgary Board of Education, and they said, not a chance. There's wood in that plan. Katie said, well, yes, like it's a natural playground. And they said, wood's not allowed, you might get a sliver. And so Katie said, well, what are we allowed? So the supervisor brought out all the beautiful primary colored plastic play spaces and said, you have to use these. So how do we work around that? And I think one of the things that, you know, the ECEs have been telling us, heard a story the other day from my sister-in-law who works in an early learning program. She says they take the children to the playground next door. They can't allow them to climb the monkey bars. They can't use anything that turns, so no merry-go-rounds. They can't use anything that tips, so no teeter-totters. And they can't play tag. What do you do in a playground other than to say to the kids, look at them, isn't that look like fun, but don't do it? So she said the kids don't want to go to the playground anymore. So there was a really interesting person that I met in Gatineau. Sport for Life holds a national summit every year in Gatineau. And there's an amazing woman by the name of Brandy Tannenbaum who works at Sunnybrook Hospital. She has what I think is the most boring title in the world. She is a risk management consultant. But she's an amazing person. So she talked about making a really clear distinction between hazards and risks. So hazards are broken equipment, sharp equipment, needles on the playground, that sort of thing. Eliminate hazards. Like, don't even play around with those. Risks, we don't want to eliminate risks. We want to manage risks. We want to teach children how to take risks safely. We want them to figure out how to walk along a bumpy log on the ground. We want them to learn to stretch and climb. I have a colleague who was the Canadian chair of the Paralympic Association. He works in the phys ed department at our university. He was saying that children nowadays have no upper body strength. So the exercise he uses it, and try it. Put both hands on your chair, bend your elbows. Can you lift your bottom off the chair? With just your arms, no legs. No legs. Oh, some of you are doing very well. What David Legg was telling us is that because children are no longer allowed to climb trees or climb monkey bars or climb some of the climbers that we used to have in elementary school when I taught, They're not allowed to climb because there's a risk of falling. They're not developing upper body strength. Really interesting. Like we're actually changing our physiology because of what we do or do not allow children to do, which is quite interesting. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd encourage you to read a book called Too Safe for Their Own Good. Michael Unger out of Dalhousie University. And he talks about how we are bubble wrapping our children, trying to keep them safe from everything. We talk about the helicopter parent. And oh my gosh, at university, we're dealing with helicopter parents. I get phone calls from parents all the time. Well, how well is my child doing in your class? Well, first of all, I don't have any children in my class. They're all over the age of 18. And I can't tell you how they're doing in my class. But I pay tuition. I have a right to know. Then you need to ask your child how well he or she is doing in class, right? So I've heard of helicopter parents going to their children's first job interviews, for heaven's sakes. In the Scandinavian countries, they refer to them as curling parents. And those of you who curl know that the prime job of 3 members on the team is to sweep in front of the rock to make sure there's no debris that's going to deflect the rock from any direction for another. So Brandy, this risk management consultant person at Sunnybrook, says there is more risk, more developmental risk to a child, to trying to eliminate risk, than there is to letting them learn how to manage risk. And again, Michael Unger has a really good story about that. He talks about being in the playground with his children. There's a little 4-year-old climbing the monkey bar. And Mom started back on the bench. And then the little girl gets up to the 2nd or 3rd rung, and Mom gets off the bench and starts to walk a little bit closer. Be careful now. Careful, careful. Little girl keeps going, big grin. Mom gets a little bit closer. Now be really careful. You're getting awful high up there, you know. It'll hurt if you fall. Little girl just keeps climbing up. Finally, Mom's standing underneath. I can't reach you now if you get stuck. And the little girl breaks into tears. So all the joy and confidence she was building, Mom totally destroyed because she was afraid she would fall. And yes, she may fall. But then she's going to learn how to stay on next time. And then she knows that she has a skill, and she's building her confidence. So that's all the pieces that we're going to be working with around the risky play. I'm not sure how far we'll get. We don't have nearly the same cooperative relationship between our health units and our human services as you do here in this province, so we'll see. And that's that. Any questions or comments?